So I want to talk about three particular sets of issues. And everyone knows that China's growth rate, 9% a year, has essentially been sustaining the global economy for the last several years. But China faces two major questions. Everybody questions the sustainability of the growth process in China. They're seeing it as unbalanced, distorted. There are many people who think the economy is going to collapse rather than take over the world. And then what is happening in the United States and the Eurozone is going to be highly risky for China and increased volatility. And this is the context that China is looking at in terms of its longer-term policies. But given the audience here in Singapore, I'm going to focus a little bit more on some of these issues in terms of how China is affecting the region and what you should be thinking about over the next decade. There are three major questions that people are debating, particularly in the West, but even in Asia. The general question that China's growth process seems to be very unbalanced. Consumption, GDP, is very low, the lowest in the world. Its investment ratio is the highest in the world. This is seen as being distorted, and it is being seen by some as meaning that China will inevitably collapse. Second, China's trade surpluses. The fact that it has more than $3 trillion of reserves. This creates enormous tensions with the U.S. and the West. How can this be dealt with? And the third issue, because I actually think it's the most important issue for the next 10 years, how is China going to move up the innovation chain, and will it? And in all these areas, I want to talk a little bit about how this might affect Southeast Asia. And I want to talk about it in a way that's normally not the way people focus it on. I want to actually go back historically, because China's so-called unbalanced growth is essentially a strategy which Deng Xiaoping launched. Everyone thinks it's a current issue. It was actually an issue 30 years ago. Now, Deng Xiaoping, in the late 70s, realized that China's very poor, but huge labor force could be an asset rather than a liability. He also realized that the key to China's success was to concentrate activity, build economies of scale, and specialize. And this was a total change in what China was doing prior to then. This map shows what Deng Xiaoping did in the early 70s and in the 80s. First, he said, I'm going to put all my incentives, tax incentives, subsidies, credit, I'm going to concentrate along the coast, and those circles represent the areas which were given special incentives, starting off with Guangdong province, Fujian, then Shanghai, then all the border areas, and then down the Yangtze River. Only those areas would get special incentives. It's a model totally geared toward production for export. Secondly, he did something which no other country could do. He said, I'm going to put my money on the coastal areas. So rather than give 50% of the coast and 50% of the rest of China, he allocated his finances so that 2/3 of it went to the coast and 1/3 of it went to the poor interior. This is completely different from most countries, which tend to spread around, and most countries tend to give more money to the poor areas rather than rich. Deng Xiaoping did exactly the opposite. And he spent most of that on infrastructure, roads, highways, communications. If you go back to 1978, China's transport network was incredible because it was so even. Every part of China had the same density of roads, which didn't make economic economic sense. So starting from the 90s, the road network, transportation, communication network builds up Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong province, but today it's starting to move inland. And that moving inland is going to change the nature of China's economy for the next 10 years, and I'll get to that. And then he allowed people to move. So migrant workers come from everywhere. 200 million Chinese move from the interior areas to the coastal areas. So you provide incentives along the coast, you provide money along the coast, you allow people to move on the coast, and you get a production process and specialization and economies of scale which have never been seen in this world. the structure of industry changes. All the export-oriented industries are located along the coast. These bars show the intensity of export-oriented industries and where they're located. This is the location of domestically oriented raw material industries that are much more even. Now, if you look at a map of the location of industries 30 years ago, it looks completely different than it is today. So Deng Xiaoping changed not only the product line, but the strategy changed where industries were located. And the consequence was an extraordinary rapid growth rate. The red line is the growth rate for China as a whole. The other three lines are regional growth rates. The blue line is the coastal area, high. The yellow line is the far west, and the green line is the central region. Now, what's extraordinary about China, first of all, is how consistently high the growth rate was for most of this period, except for the Tiananmen dip. But if you take away the Tiananmen dip, what is extraordinary for China is that for 20 years, the growth rate never fell below 8%. Now, no country has had that. There have been countries which have been growing as rapidly as China for long periods of time, but no country has had such a stable high growth rate. Now, the other thing I want to show you here is growth was led by the coastal area, the blue line, for much of this period. So this unbalanced growth led, as you would expect, to the coastal income levels increasing more rapidly. But today, the coastal area is growing slower than the interior. So the far west is growing faster than the coastal areas. And over the last 6 months, there are some numbers which actually say that growth in the Shanghai-Beijing area is actually slowed to almost zero. But the west and the interior is accelerating. So there is now a regional shift in the focus of growth. It's going to change again the location of industries in China in a slightly different way in the next 10 years. Now let me get back to the unbalanced growth. Extraordinarily rapid growth, but everyone's concerned about the fact that the share of consumption to GDP has fallen to the lowest in the world, 35% of GDP, and the growth rate of investment has risen to 45% of GDP. And most people have said this is not sustainable, this is a problem. And my point I'd like to get into is it's not really necessarily a problem. Let's take a look at the consumption to GDP ratio for China. It's the black line. You can see that it has been falling dramatically or significantly for the last 20 years as a share of GDP. But I want you to look at the ratio for the other three major success stories in Asia: Japan, Taiwan, South Korea. And what you can see is that they all experienced this decline in the consumption GDP ratio during their industrialization phase. Now, how do you explain this decline in consumption to GDP ratio? Why does it occur? And it occurs for a very simple reason. As you move from agriculture to industry, labor's share of income as a share of GDP falls. So the average farmer in China working in the rural areas, before the reforms, let's say he produced $100 of agricultural commodities. Of that $100, $90 went to him, labor income. So labor income in agriculture is 90%. And then if you get 90% labor income, you consume. And you consume most of it. So consumption to GDP ratio is very, very high when you're in agriculture. Now, labor share of income in industry is 45%. In services is 50%. So as workers move from agriculture to industry and services in China, labor share of income paradoxically declines. The consumption to GDP ratio ironically declines, but you grow faster. And that's essentially what happened in Korea, Japan, Taiwan. It actually happened in the United States in 1900. The share of consumption of GDP in the U.S. fell by 50 percentage points of GDP during its industrialization phase. Now, does this mean that consumption is being repressed? Because the other argument is, well, there's something wrong. Household consumption is being repressed. This creates part of the trade imbalance. This is a problem.